if Wes Streeting had said something critical of Keir Starmer, or something which was clearly coded as an attack on his leadership or the direction of the government, at that moment, you can step in and respond.
Expose him as a traitor. By the way, I'm absolutely Ed, I'm loving this criminology. This is like, who's standing next to the, party secretary at the the Red Day parade?
How many people have been removed from Downing Street in the last year because they were sorting out the operation? Sue Gray's got to go, she's no good. Liz Loy's got to go, she's no good. They've been through 3 different directors of communication who've all been ditched along the way.
I mean, it does feel like there's going to be a moment, doesn't there? There's going to be a sort of, doesn't mean, by the way, Keir Starmer falls, but there'll have to be some kind of reckoning, some kind of John Major put up or shut up moment.
So we are back. It is Thursday morning. We are recording remotely today. And, there's quite a lot going on in the world. The British politics in turmoil, international relations in turmoil. We're going to be talking about all these things this week. The BBC in turmoil. But in the Financial Times today, hot seat BBC seeks boss with talent and political savvy. And who is in the list of runners and risers, second after Charlotte Moore, the former BBC boss, George Osborne, with a picture of you. You are being tipped to run the BBC.
Well, of course, I'm flattered every time one of these kind of establishment jobs comes up, isn't it?
Can you fit it in?
Well, I guess, first of all, I could commission this podcast, couldn't I? That would be an early step I could take as DG. And I've got a very good candidate, if I was Director General, for the real job that needs filling at the BBC, which is who's going to host Strictly Come Dancing. I thought Mr. Edward Balls could be my first appointment.
Look, we'll have to get my people to talk to your people about that. We'll have to get the agents involved. Look, George Osborne, former Chancellor, run a major media organisation, the Evening Standard, runs a major cultural organisation, the British Museum, international reach, banker, experience in fundraising, clearly politically independent, knows all about the tough decisions. And let's be honest, given that as Chancellor, you managed to completely shaft the BBC in the licence fee negotiations, poacher turned gamekeeper, you'd totally know what the Treasury would be up to, totally outmaneuver them. I also think the other thing which we should say to Number 10, that, if they want to end this podcast, and maybe they do, what better way to get political currency off the air than to make you Director General?
It is true that when I was interviewing for the job of being chair of the British Museum, quite understandably, actually, the board at the time were concerned, hold on, you're a former politician, would you be independent enough? And independent at the time, there was like a Tory government. And the BBC and the British Museum was very kind of protective of its independence. And my basic pitch for the job was, look, no one knows these bastards better than me. I'm your best guarantor of independence. I absolutely know how they operate and think. So yes, it is true that having done 2 BBC licence fee negotiations, I certainly know how the Treasury thinks about these things.
And when I say politically independent, what I mean is nobody could say you were a Labour stooge. So therefore,
Well, I don't think I'm a Labour stooge. I don't think anyone would say I'm a Tory stooge anymore.
We should get on with our podcast. We're going to come to the BBC in a moment. But first of all, where are we going to start?
Let's start with the quite extraordinary events this week in Number 10 Downing Street. The attack on the Health Secretary, Wes Streeting, the night before he was due to do a media round and talk about some new announcements in the health service. We had people who clearly the senior political journalists of Fleet Street and the BBC and others felt were speaking on behalf of the Prime Minister, coming out and saying that Keir Starmer would see off any challenge to his leadership, that he would fight for the leadership of the Labour Party, that in particular Wes Streeting was on manoeuvres and they had an eye on him. And the extraordinary thing about all of this was none of this speculation was in the media at that point. It wasn't Downing Street responding to this speculation. It was Downing Street creating this speculation. And it led to Wes Streeting having to defend himself the next morning on the media round. I guess many people listening to this podcast would have heard some of that. I was listening to him on the Today program, and I have to say, I thought he did a very, very good job. It was a masterclass in how to do quite a tricky Today program interview. Here is the Health Secretary explaining himself to the Today program audience.
What's your message then to people who have been briefing this? What would you say to them?
Well, firstly, I'd like to commend them for at least taking on board the feedback about sexist briefings, because we've seen this before. Lucy Powell, Bridget Phillipson, Angela Rayner could go around pretty much the entire cabinet table. So at least they're picking on one of the boys now. When Lucy Powell stood to be deputy leader of the Labour Party and said there needed to be a culture change in how we lead and how the party is managed, I think she has been vindicated. I do think that trying to kneecap one of your own team when they are out, not just making the case for the government, but actually delivering the change that we promised, I think that is also self-defeating and self-destructive behaviour. I can tell you, without having even spoken to the Prime Minister, what he thinks of briefing, what his reaction will be to the front pages and the broadcast bulletins overnight. And I wouldn't expect him to waste loads of time on this. I just think, and this interview is in many ways a reflection of the problem. We're spending way too much time talking about what is ultimately Westminster bubble nonsense and trivia. I think whoever's been briefing this has been watching too much Celebrity Traitors, and this is just about the worst attack on a faithful I've seen since Joe Marler was kicked out and banished in the final.
That was a kind of medley. So we don't get ourselves into the trouble the BBC has got itself into. Let's be clear. We spliced together different clips from Wes Streeting's interview there. But look, he came out batting, didn't he? And he was, very loyal to the Prime Minister and everything he said, and at the same time taking a massive swipe at the team at Downing Street. I guess the question for you, Ed, is, quite often in a party, you get ideological splits, you get factional conflict. I mean, you saw it, under the kind of Brexit rows with the Theresa May government, for example. You quite often get a huge personality whose ambition is really hard for a party to contain. So arguably, Roy Jenkins in the 1970s for Labour was a kind of difficult person for the Labour leadership to handle. And Michael Heseltine, arguably, with Margaret Thatcher, Boris Johnson with David Cameron, Theresa May. I mean, Wes Streeting's clearly ambitious to be Prime Minister, but it's perfectly manageable. And I think he would have expected to have to wait quite a few years for the Starmer premiership to run its course before having a crack at number 10. So it doesn't sort of fit into those categories of kind of, leadership challenges or leadership issues inside a party. And I guess it to my mind, it speaks more of, the basics, which is the government's unpopular, the Prime Minister's unpopular. By the way, we just heard the economy is not doing well today. Latest figures show the economy grew just 0.1%. So the overall backdrop for the government is pretty miserable. And yet, into all of this, it feels like an entirely sort of self-inflicted wound by the Starmer operation and the people who claim to speak for him. I mean, I guess it's a sort of straightforward question, but what on earth has really been going on?
Look, it's really hard to read the runes because it has been such a wild 48 hours, and there are so many people talking to the newspapers and to the broadcasters from within number 10 and more widely, and often in a quite contradictory way. I think you can say, ostensibly, they set out to try and weaken Wes Streeting because they believe he is on manoeuvres. And as you said, look, the government's unpopular. Keir Starmer is unpopular. Wes Streeting, in recent weeks, we've noted that he's taken a different line on ID cards. He said things about Gaza which were different from what the Prime Minister was saying. And it would be totally unsurprising in any political moment if people who are your supporters in Parliament aren't thinking to themselves, if Keir Starmer at some point falls on his sword, are we ready for the leadership election to come? But they decide to go out, as you say, in this very heavy, clearly authorised briefing. There is no way Chris Mason on the 10 o'clock news on the BBC says this is what is being said about Wes Streeting, unless he believes this is very authoritative. And in that moment, they transform Wes Streeting from seeming like, in their mind, somebody who is causing them some trouble behind the scenes, to, in public, the innocent party who's been wrong. This has come completely out of the blue. Wes Streeting is allowed to go on the Today programme and has permission to say incredibly heavy things about the toxic culture in Number 10, pointing the finger at not just people in Number 10, but Morgan McSweeney, the Chief of Staff in particular. When he uses the word kneecap, I think Wes Streeting is absolutely pointing the finger in Morgan McSweeney's direction, because, of course, Morgan McSweeney in his family has history in Ireland, and with the IRA, his grandfather was an activist. That is what that was signalling. And as a consequence...
You think it was deliberate? You think... Sorry, I mean, it's an interesting observation. The use of the word kneecap was a deliberate kind of reference to...
I don't know that, but I would say every Westminster watcher in the lobby heard that and immediately made that connection. And Wes Streeting is very skilled and very smart and will have known exactly what he was doing. Keir Starmer at that point in Prime Minister's questions is hugely on the defensive. He will be thinking to himself, how have I been put in this position? Although interestingly, when he then goes to the parliamentary committee, which is the senior backbenchers in the afternoon, he's actually rather less...
This is after PMQs.
After PMQs, he's less accommodating. He says, that he's standing by Morgan McSweeney. He's a bit dismissive of all of this, which kind of causes quite a big reaction in the Parliamentary Labour Party over the course of the afternoon. What is really going on was your question. I think there's just a few things to note as you read the runes. First of all, from the briefings, I think it is pretty clear that Keir Starmer knew what was going to be done. That Keir Starmer... It says in The Guardian today that he is still cross with Wes Streeting, that this was a strategy he had signed off. I don't think Morgan McSweeney and the senior Downing Street team do this in such a widespread way to the media without any reference to Keir Starmer, and they are clearly now telling people that there was a strategic conversation about the need to put markers down. Keir Starmer's going nowhere. He will fight any challenge to him. He is going to deliver for the country in Downing Street. That was not something which was being said without Keir Starmer being involved. I think Keir Starmer knew about that, was part of the conversation, probably at the weekend. This was not a surprise to him.
Can I just press you on that? But I know you've got other points to make. Just so, I mean, that, sometimes there are politicians who let things be done on their behalf, and they kind of know it's going on, but they don't ever sort of want to be party to the conversation. Are you saying like Keir Starmer knew, he just sort of said, someone deal with all this leadership speculation, or someone take Wes Streeting down a peg or two? Do we know enough about how, because of course the way he presents himself is I'm not the usual politician. I didn't grow up in Westminster. I was a serious lawyer. That I don't play these kind of games. I mean, that's the way he's projected himself and the way he speaks about himself in public. But you're suggesting he must have actually, he knew something like this was going to happen, even if he didn't know exactly how it was going to be done.
Well, I think there is a distinction in your question between this being said in general and Wes Streeting, and let me come to that in a moment. On the former point, it is often the case that prime ministers, and I've been involved in these conversations with prime minister or chancellors, they agree that we need a strategic move, but they don't get involved in the detail. But I think the argument, the markets won't wear it, I'm going nowhere, anybody thinks I'm being pushed aside, no way, that is something which Keir was part of before the briefing, and his aides are now telling people, it's in The Guardian and The Times today, that he knew. This was not a strategy that he was oblivious to at all. Secondly, though, if you look at the original briefing, which went to Patrick Maguire on The Times, the original briefing is about people who are causing trouble. There aren't names. And then what happens is the briefing over the evening gets supercharged with the injection of the name Wes Streeting. Now, the guys doing this briefing from Number 10, they must have known people would go immediately to Wes Streeting. They might go to Shabana Mahmood. They might go to Andy Burnham. But that wasn't part of the original briefing in the afternoon.
So the hit job on Wes Streeting was not part of the original Downing Street plan?
I think it was not part of the original Downing Street plan. Keir Starmer won't have known about that hit job, and he's probably rightly angry about that because he thinks it's really stupid, which, by the way, it was. And if you look at the newspapers, there is now a big thing going on within Downing Street as to where that came from. Was it Morgan McSweeney? Well, it's pretty clear that Wes Streeting thinks it was. However, Morgan and others are saying that didn't come from us. We don't know why that happened. And then if you start to kind of read the runes, who could have done this? It started yesterday morning with people saying, is it Cabinet Office sources? Which could have been somebody close to Keir, like Chris Ward, his former aide, who's now Cabinet Office Minister. Could it have been one of the other junior ministers? The thing which then kind of arrives in the Guardian overnight is a briefing from Number 10 sources. Number 10 sources saying relations have also deteriorated between McSweeney and Darren Jones, the Chief Secretary to the Prime Minister, who is understood to be frustrated at how frequently the government's attention is pulled onto scandals or briefing and counter-briefing. So the interesting thing about that is Darren Jones's people having a pop at McSweeney, but they are described
Does Darren Jones
as
have people? Sorry, that's a serious question. Is there a sort of Darren Jones? I thought he's just, he's like a loyal Starmer aide.
He has special advisors, but Downing Street sources here are not Morgan McSweeney or Tim Allen or the Number 10 operation. This is Darren Jones's people described as Number 10 sources, and that is leading people in the Number 10 operation to say maybe the hyping up of the Wes Streeting element was done by not a Cabinet Office minister, some junior guy, maybe by Darren Jones, who as Chief Political Secretary to the Prime Minister can be described as a Number 10 source. How has this happened? Well, Darren Jones, who's not so keen on either Morgan McSweeney or Wes Streeting in recent weeks, it seems, decides to enter into the story. That is the speculation that they are saying, which is why they are a bit affronted by the Wes Streeting attack. But then the Guardian reports this morning, I mean, it is so fascinating, that Keir...
By the way, I'm absolutely I'm loving this criminology. This is like, who's standing next to the party secretary at the Red Day parade,
In the Guardian today, there are 6 different things being said at the same time from people in Number 10. It includes, by the way, Darren Jones having a pop at Morgan McSweeney and speculation back that actually is Darren Jones involved in this. Starmer is still angry at Wes Streeting for what he's been doing, particularly around welfare, digital ID in Gaza, although Keir Starmer also thinks that he's a highly effective minister. A source from Number 10 says there was no direct briefing against Wes from anyone, but then another source says that there was a briefing, but it wasn't meant to be against Wes, it was just meant to be in general. So the reason why Keir Starmer can be angry at PMQs about the Wes briefing is because he's been told by his people that didn't come from us. But the reason why he has to stand by Morgan McSweeney to the Parliamentary Committee in the afternoon is because the more general idea that he's going on and he's seeing off these plotters, that wasn't something done by stray briefers and junior guys in Number 10. That was something which they had decided strategically to do, by the way, really foolishly, because if you set off with a massively heavy briefing on a Tuesday evening to lots of different senior journalists, the danger of you losing control is very high, and they completely lost control over about 3 hours, which ends up with this massive crisis, which inadvertently, although predictably, has ended up strengthening Wes Streeting, who they were trying to take down, or somebody was trying to take down, or the plotters who they were definitely trying to take down, and has weakened Keir Starmer, even though Keir thought this was being done to show he was strong. So, I mean, it is chaos.
Right. No, I think I follow all of that. So on Wes Streeting, I've spoken to a few Labour ministers in the last couple of weeks who have said to me, Wes is on manoeuvres a bit. And I wondered whether you thought, Gordon Brown was always quite good at kind of knocking out kind of rivals who were, emerging. People like Alan Milburn and Stephen Byers and Charles Clarke. They were kind of taken down a few pegs by the Brown team. I don't know if are we seeing something similar to that? Although, of course, that was Gordon before he became Prime Minister. And it's quite a different thing as a Prime Minister to take down your own cabinet, which seems a bit, well, put it mildly, more than a bit self-defeating. So first question to you, follow up is like, is the kind of taking down of Wes Streeting justified a bit because Wes is getting ahead of himself and indeed kind of trying to establish himself as distinct on some issues like ID cards and Gaza?
I think when Tony Blair was Prime Minister and knew that at some point he was going to leave, there was always going to be people who were positioning themselves and doing some preparations. And as a political leader, you have to be relaxed about that. The times when Gordon Brown, as Chancellor, was able to respond heavily was when people overstepped the mark. So when Alan Milburn pops up with some briefing about tax policy or Stephen Byers on the euro, when these were Treasury responsibilities, then you could push back against that. But actually, I think the interesting thing, I think you're wrong about Gordon Brown there. In fact, he faced these kind of plots quite regularly when he was Prime Minister. In the autumn of 2007, before the conference, but also in the July, a David Miliband article which arrived out of the blue in The Guardian about the state of the government, didn't mention Gordon Brown, hadn't been cleared by Number 10. There was then the James Pennell plot in the summer of 2009 to try and leave Gordon Brown out and David Miliband in, and then in January 2010, the Steve Byers, Jeff Hoon letter. So there were 4 different times. I think that the thing that you have to do when you're a Prime Minister and you face these kind of challenges is you have to be patient and you have to wait until the person who's doing the manoeuvring makes a mistake and goes too far. If Wes Streeting had said something critical of Keir Starmer or something which was clearly coded as an attack on his leadership or the direction of the government, at that moment, you can step in and respond,
expose him as a traitor,
and say put up or shut up.
To use the celebrity
exactly.
traitors thing.
And if you go to that David Miliband article in The Guardian in July 2007, first of all, the article emerges. Number 10 say, why is David Miliband saying these things? David doesn't respond at all. It ends up in the conference speech in September with Gordon Brown being able to say this is no time for a novice, because David didn't put up. The difference here is that they were not patient. If it was the case, but by the way, I don't think there was any evidence that Wes Streeting was doing anything untoward. He was just being a politician who's thinking the polls are bad and at some point there might be a change. I need to be ready. And by the way, I'm going to flex my muscles a little bit on ID cards or on Gaza. Suddenly they
by the way, he's also got a highly marginal seat, hasn't he? So Gaza is a real issue for him locally, yeah.
But because they piled in so hard when there hadn't been the overt provocation, they turned him into the innocent party. And did Wes Streeting hide in the way David Miliband did when their pushback came from Number 10? Absolutely not. As you said earlier, he went out and with great clarity, credibility and political savvy, totally pushed back. And he said things which in normal circumstances would be terrible things to say. I mean, he said Number 10 has a toxic culture, but because he was the wronged party with an attack which came out of the blue. And so if you think there is that kind of plotting going on, you have to wait and you have to be patient. And when they make a mistake, that's the point when you call them out. If you go early like this, it's naive and self-defeating. And that is why Keir Starmer and his team end up in such a mess. It's why Morgan McSweeney's job is suddenly being questioned in all the newspapers today, because it was such a strategic error to do what they did on Tuesday. Even if the Wes Streeting attack wasn't part of the strategy, implicitly, that's what they were doing. And they were doing it in a way which looked unprovoked.
Okay, so last week we were speculating idly, and before all this happened, that in fact there may be a change of personnel in Downing Street. And we were speculating that Tom Baldwin or Tim Allen or Jonathan Powell might come in, or Louise Casey might come in to be the kind of new chief of staff, and that Morgan McSweeney would kind of revert to more the campaigning role that he has traditionally had. Where do you think all of this leaves the kind of Downing Street operation? Because it feels at the moment kind of pretty shredded, doesn't it? I mean, it's worth just hearing, by the way, isn't it? Keir Starmer has to, in PMQs, against some quite effective questions from Kemi Badenoch, has to say things which no Prime Minister really wants to say. This is just a clip from him.
And let me be clear, of course, Mr. Speaker, I've never authorised attacks on Cabinet members. I appointed them to their posts because they're the best people to carry out their jobs.
I think if you are the Prime Minister, the one thing you don't want in the House of Commons is to be laughed at when you say something big and serious. And I'm afraid if you have a Downing Street operation on that scale and impact, which was clearly targeted at Cabinet Ministers, even if they didn't intend it to be called out against Wes in quite the same way it happened, to then say it's nothing to do with me, Gov, doesn't quite cut it. You had Alistair Campbell and Tom Baldwin on the Today programme this morning, both being careful not to name names. But when Alistair Campbell says, when you become the story, that's a huge problem. Morgan McSweeney has clearly become the story now. But I think the issue is competence, how they ended up in this situation. How you end up with a Downing Street, which has, clearly there are multiple people speaking to the media as a number 10 spokesperson or source, contradicting each other and clearly saying things which are more self-interested than in the Prime Minister's interest. In the end, the leadership in Downing Street, the Prime Minister and the Chief of Staff, have to take responsibility for the effectiveness of their operation. And in the last 48 hours, their operation has been deeply candid, and they've got to sort it out. And I mean, how many people have been removed from Downing Street in the last year because they were sorting out the operation? Sue Gray's got to go, she's no good. Liz Loy's got to go, she's no good. They've been through 3 different directors of communication who've all been ditched along the way. You have to ask some big questions about why is ditching the medium ranking people not solving the problem.
No, I think it is striking. I think if you look at the kind of Cameron or Blair operation, I mean, obviously there are lots of problems along the way, but their Downing Street team, number 10 Downing Street teams, were utterly loyal to them. Utterly loyal. There were big figures, big egos and so on, but there was no kind of undermining of the Prime Minister. Because the other feature of this is a lot of these people are pretty loose with their views about the abilities of the Prime Minister they're supposed to be serving in number 10. It's not just that they're fighting on behalf of Keir Starmer. They're quite rude about him if you hear them out.
And interestingly, if you go back to the Maguire-Pogren book about the Starmer operation in opposition into government, I mean, you remember the quote about who's driving the DLR train? The suggestion that Morgan McSweeney was not really loyal to Keir Starmer, much more loyal to the project, and he should be deciding who's really going to lead this. The irony in that book is who was the candidate which everybody thought in Morgan McSweeney's mind was the guy who would take over if Keir Starmer fell by the wayside. It was Wes Streeting. And the most interesting thing is that people think that Morgan McSweeney has now decided to shift camps. It's, I think, probably Shabana Mahmood rather than Wes Streeting is his chosen candidate these days, which is why when they then say the attack on Wes Streeting didn't come from us, people think, really? Really? Are you sure?
Okay, and what about the, to sort of pick up actually on Wes Streeting's Today programme interview, he says, people want to hear us talk about the real world, real policy. Obviously people who listen to our podcast are interested in politics, but we have spent, the last 15 minutes talking about, the dysfunction at the top of the leadership of the Labour Party. Where does this lead in the real world? Because I'll give you one theory. I mean, this now puts the Starmer premiership, a big question mark over whether it's going to last the Parliament. And it's not unlike, there are, I think, similarities with Boris Johnson winning in 2019. Great win, massive win. You assume he's going to be Prime Minister for 10 years. And within 3 years, he's out. And in the end, what brings him down is frustration amongst the Conservative Parliamentary Party at his handling of issues and his number 10 operation. and of course against a backdrop in which he is unpopular in the polls as well because of things like Partygate. But it's the sort of hand that, he can't run a tight ship. And Keir Starmer, here he is, he's only a year and a bit after a big election win, is in a sort of similar situation. So what do we think the real world consequences? I'll put one out there, which is I think Starmer now has to move left and start throwing red meat at the Parliamentary Labour Party to try and keep himself secure. And that will lead to more sort of, in classic sense, I'm using kind of inverted commas here, left-wing policies. So, for example, it now looks pretty clear in the budget that they will do something on the two-child limit. Keir Starmer was indicating that this week, even though, and we won't debate the merits of the policy here, but you are sort of, even though, a classic sort of political strategy would be, in a budget in which you're going to increase income tax potentially on the whole population, that is not the budget where you then say, and the money is going to be spent on some, at the moment, in opinion polls, whatever you think of the policy, pretty popular policy of two-child limit. We're going to get rid of that, and we're going to do this unpopular thing of give lots of money and benefits to families with large numbers of children. So we're going to put up people's income tax to pay for more benefits for large families. That's not a kind of classic and smart political maneuver, but it's what you might do because it's a kind of left-wing thing to do, redistribution and so on, tackling child poverty, you would say, that you would do if you're in trouble. And I think you might see more and more things. A Labour figure was suggesting to me this in the last week that they might have to revisit that campaign on the women's pension age, the WASPy women, because that's another kind of totemic left-wing cause that they had apparently said they're not going to deal with, or they weren't going to revisit. But if Starmer is in trouble, don't you get the red meat strategy?
We said last week on the podcast that the most revealing moment in the Rachel Reeves pre-budget messaging wasn't her statement in Downing Street, but it was when she was interviewed by Andrew Maha on LBC, which was if she resigned, what would the markets make of it? And we've had that confirmed in the last few days from the briefing from Number 10 was you can't get rid of Keir and Rachel because the markets won't wear it. And we'll also have to have a general election, which, by the way, is complete nonsense. I mean, there was no general election when Rishi Sunak took over or when Gordon Brown took over in 2007. So that doesn't add up. But I think the market's point is real. And I don't think the next leader of the Labour Party, whether that happens before the election, which is possible, or when Keir Starmer moves on, if it happens in government, there'll be no resiling from the fiscal rules, because I think that is the market reality. And the test that they're setting up, would the markets be destabilised by pre-budget and straight after the budget, some precipitate move to get rid of Rachel Reeves and Keir Starmer? Absolutely yes, because even though the fiscal rules I think are going to have to stay in place, there would be a question mark, and the markets are sceptical about Britain and Labour at the moment, so they're right to run that argument. I don't think, by the way, that necessarily means that you can't move on to child poverty and the two-child limit. I think in the end, leadership is about winning arguments and making them popular, and doing the right thing and winning the argument for its popularity is something which good leaders do. So I think that is absolutely up to Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves to do that if they choose to do so. And I think you can be beaten on that argument myself. I think you can win that case on fairness and its popularity too. But if Keir Starmer starts to challenge Rachel Reeves on fiscal probity because he needs to throw red meat, and start questioning the fiscal rules and market support, that would be rather contradictory to the briefing that they did this week. So I don't think that they can easily do that. But you are absolutely right. They're going to have to. They'll make more concessions, as we saw over welfare reform earlier in the year. I don't know what you think. I find this market briefing line quite difficult. It feels very defensive and risky to me. We have to stay, because if you got rid of us, the markets won't wear it. It's quite good if the IMF say that, or a market commentator says it, or the Institute for Fiscal Studies say it. But the government saying that about themselves, it's such a hostage to fortune, because if the markets do take against this government, well, in the coming weeks and months, Rachel Reeves and Keir Starmer have said, well, if the markets take against this, because they aren't trusting what's on offer, and they don't really want to be in that position. But I would say it is true that markets would be worried about something destabilising happening, but they also worry when governments look like they've not got a grip and they aren't in control. And the last couple of days have not looked like Keir Starmer was in control, and it's kind of not surprising to me there was a bit of a market wobble. So I'm not sure this is a great argument for them to run. I think it's a hostage to fortune. It's quite risky and dangerous, and it could turn out to bite them hard if they're not careful.
I mean, it does feel like there's going to be a moment, doesn't there? There's going to be a sort of, doesn't mean, by the way, Keir Starmer falls, but there'll have to be some kind of reckoning, some kind of John Major put up or shut up moment. You know, when Wes Streeting said, trying to kneecap one of your team when they're out there making the case for the government, it was actually pretty reminiscent of the Geoffrey Howe resignation speech that led to the downfall of Margaret Thatcher. There was quite a lot of parallels because he talked about having the cricket bats broken when you went out to bat for the government.
And of course, when you go back to the Tom Watson-led challenge to Tony Blair in 2006, which was at the time described as a coup, the outcome wasn't Tony Blair being forcibly, reluctantly turfed out of Downing Street through a challenge. It actually precipitated the final stage of a cooperative handover between Tony Blair and Gordon Brown. So
that's what you call the coup you organised, a cooperative handover. We've cooperatively handed over the TV station in the airport.
we have discussed this before, and without repeating myself, the one thing Gordon Brown was totally allergic to was the idea of him leading a challenge against a sitting Prime Minister, because he thought that you never recovered from that, and that was the wrong thing to do. And Wes Streeting is taking exactly the right position. And I'm just pointing out to you that one of the things which can flow from that, and I think Wes Streeting is strengthened. Keir Starmer now can't ignore him. And more than that, if Wes Streeting says things about the direction of the government now, they'll be taken more seriously across the Parliamentary Labour Party, in Parliament and more widely. And look, all Wes Streeting has to say is, there's a question about the fiscal rules and whether the markets would wear any change. I mean, he doesn't have to say this in public, but he can say it at the time of his choosing. I think spending £6 billion on an ID card system won't work. And I would abolish that crazy plan immediately and use all of that to reduce the deficit, and in so doing, strengthen the fiscal position rather than weakening it. They've handed over ammunition to him, and he can just decide at what point to deploy it. He doesn't have to do that precipitately. He doesn't have to do that in a challenging way. But he's strengthened by this, and that can't be what they intended.
I mean, I do think Wes Streeting's run at leadership, got off to the best possible start when he did an interview with us over the summer on our podcast. And we will be doing some more interviews, won't we, as we get close to Christmas with some other people. So, where it all started, right here.
I'm told he's coming to hear Centrist Dad live in December.
Oh,
so
that's the surest sign. That's the surest sign that he's got his eye on the top.